Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located, and welcome to our next webinar in our Quick Fire webinar series. I'm Chris Harvey. Today's session is on post-recall strategy, so recovery, reputation, and resilience. Our next webinar will be in November. It's our quarterly recall index for Q3, where we'll look at data and trends for that quarter, and we'll compare it to other quarters and other years as well to see what's going on. We may also try to fit in another quickfire webinar at the end of October. So it could be on recall insurance, could be on fraud with recalls, or another topic. But if you have ideas, please go ahead and put those into the chat module and we'll take a look at them. So I'm Chris Harvey again. I'm Senior Vice President of Client Services with Sedgwick. I've been working on recalls now for over 20 years, so there's definitely a right way to do recalls and a wrong way to do them. I am very lucky and honored to be joined by an expert, Jared Nelson with DGA. Jared, I'll pass it over to you just to introduce yourself.
Awesome. Great to be with all you today. And thanks so much, Chris and Sedgwick, for having me. I'm Jared Nelson. I work for DGA Group, a global consulting firm where I lead our crisis management practice. And so what my team and I focus on is helping companies prepare for or respond to anything that can impact the reputation of their business. So think a cyber attack, litigation, the president insults your company, all the above. But an area where I really focus and where a large part of my time has been spent has been on product safety related issues. So I've probably supported over 100 recalls over the years, plenty of other safety issues that didn't end up in resulting in enforcement action. So that's the kind of work that I and my team are helping with day in and day out. I know it's maybe not the most fun topic for everyone, but really excited to be here today to talk about it.
Great to have you on, Jared. So just to set the stage, while there are different things companies can do to reduce the likelihood or mitigate the likelihood of having recalls, you can't just completely prevent them from happening. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. So they are going to occur. And an effective recall response, it's not just about containment of a current issue. It's not just about the corrective action at this time. It's really about trust. So turning a moment of vulnerability for a company into a chance to really showcase that a company is upholding their promise and commitment to safety and to quality as well. It's turning consumer concerns into more renewed confidence. It's turning a short-term disruption into long-term resiliency. So for companies, a lot of times a recall is a negative event. But if they're properly prepared and they're willing to invest in that preparation and run the recall right, there can be a little bit of a silver lining in what they typically think of as a negative event. So we'll jump in here. I do want to remind the audience that your lines are muted, but you can enter questions into the chat module. We'll save about 5 minutes at the end to address some of your questions. I may peek at them throughout the discussion and throw some out, but for the most part, we'll wait till the end. So with that, Jared, let's dive into some categories and questions. So first off, what are the most common missteps companies make during a product recall, and how can these lead to long-term reputational damage?
Well, we only have 30 minutes, but I'll try to just highlight a couple that I've seen that are maybe a little bit less obvious. And I think, again, from a reputational standpoint, right, the number one mess up that I see is companies that do the bare minimum when they communicate about a recall. And this is often what happens when legal takes total ownership of the recall response. And this is not a knock on my lawyer friends. Clearly the legal team should be the quarterback of the response. But, a lot of times what happens is that when there's nobody from communications or marketing involved, the companies treat recalls like a check the box exercise. We're going to follow the corrective action plan to a T and not go beyond what we've promised in the CAP. And for most companies that doesn't work because most CAPs aren't really highly tailored to each company. I mean, that's the honest truth. Most CAPs don't pay special attention to who a company's audiences are or where those audiences live online. So For example, let's just say you work for a company that manufactures baby products and you're going through a recall. You do the bare minimum in terms of what's required in the cap from a communication standpoint. You're posting the information about the recall on your website and on social media, and you notify all your retailers and distributors directly. Like, all that is great. But there's a couple problems with that. If that's all you're doing, one, you're probably not going to do anything to influence media coverage about the recall, which, as you said, it's like an inherently negative event, and media coverage is going to reflect that. And two, you're not going to reach consumers in all the different little corners of the internet where they probably hang out, like on Reddit threads or mommy blogs or TikTok. And so, what happens in these cases where you do the bare minimum, the company kind of loses control of the narrative around the recall because they're not communicating in any sort of targeted or meaningful way. And so when we lose control, that means that other voices who may have wrong information or may be biased against your company, they start to own the narrative. So companies going through a recall, they really need to think hard about, when the recall is announced, how will our consumers hear about it? Where will they talk about it online? And plan, the strategy around that versus just planning on what's required in the cap. I have others I can share, but I know that it's kind of a fundamental one, and want to give you the chance to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think a lot of times companies think about checking the regulatory box, but they don't actually map out the consumer experience, the patient experience to see. And that's a big miss, I think, on their end, because recalls can very much so impact brands, good and bad. So I think understanding that scope of the compliance, the liability mitigation, but also the brand and the consumer customer experience can be very important. Yeah. Yeah. So next question, in what ways does a well-executed corrective action plan influence customer trust and loyalty? And I'll add to that too, what ongoing actions should companies take even after the immediate recall announcement as well? So two questions there.
Yeah, I mean, so you said it at the top, Chris. I think to some extent, consumers, and maybe it's just because of the sheer volume of them, but like, I think consumers, they know that recalls happen. Like, depending on the nature of the recall, I do think companies are afforded some grace by their consumers, especially if they have, existing strong brand loyalty. And so recalls aren't always necessarily a net negative to reputation. I think when companies run a really strong recall campaign, it really can reinforce trust and loyalty. And I've seen this like firsthand. I've experienced this. Like, if you think about your own personal experiences with a recall or any problem you're having with a company, when the company is at least like on top of it, provides good customer service, I find myself coming away with a positive impression. But on the flip side, if the operational and logistical parts of the recall are a complete mess, there's only so much we can say like to make things better. And so, not to diminish what I do for a living, but communications truly can only do so much. Like, if the call center wait times are an hour long, like, people are not going to be happy. If the recall website crashes the day of the announcement, people are going to be upset. If your replacement product isn't ready to go, and you could go on and on. But the number one way to avoid these situations is to invest like money, resources, time, etc., in making sure that things run smoothly, like, period. And Sedgwick didn't pay me to say that, but that's the truth. Like, you have to get the logistical stuff right, or else the communications honestly doesn't matter as much. After the recall is announced, it's really important to make sure you're actually listening to the feedback you're getting and reacting accordingly. So this is like the second part of your question. You have to be constantly monitoring not just, the direct information you're hearing from your leadership team, but like monitoring media and social media to gauge customer sentiment. And you should be getting daily recaps from your customer service teams on how long wait times are, what are the most common complaints, You should be getting readouts from like your sales teams on what they're hearing from their customers and prospects. And so as you're getting specific feedback over the life cycle of the recall, like it's good to know what's going on, but you actually have to kind of incorporate all of that feedback into your response. You have to be recalibrating the response based on that feedback. So net, like this should be a fluid response that's reactive to what we're seeing and what we're hearing. So treating the response as something that's kind of living, and being a little bit agile to make sure that you're actually responding to what you are hearing and seeing.
Yeah, it can't be a set it and forget it. You got to keep a close eye. And I always say this 95% rule that I see all the time. Companies prepare for the 95%, and then the 5% surprises them. And there's always surprises with recalls, but how you adapt to that is really important. If you don't adapt well, then you spend 95% of your time working on this 5%. But if you're monitoring it, looking out for it, you can definitely save a ton of time and quickly adjust your recall strategy.
Yeah, and what I would say too is like what happens. So the way I always look at, every client I work for, when we do recalls, they always want to know, well, how bad is media coverage going to be? They're like, what is media coverage going to look like? And there's a number of factors that could influence uh, how much media attention you get. But one thing to realize is like typically day one, even day two of a news cycle about a recall, it's pretty straightforward. And those of you who have been through this, you probably know this, right? Like initial media reporting about a recall is pretty vanilla and cookie cutter. Like X company is recalling Y product because of whatever hazard, and the product was sold at these retailers, and here's what consumers should do about it. Like it's very straightforward in the beginning. It's like those day two stories or those week two stories where recalls really become a reputational problem because either they didn't handle the initial response right, they didn't get the logistics right, or reporters begin digging into more systemic contextual things like, is this their fourth recall of the year? Did they know about the problem 12 years ago? They didn't do it. Like those are like the day two stories that you want to avoid. Like in some respects, you can't avoid the initial news cycle. It is what it is. The best you can hope for is for it to be straightforward. If you screw up the immediate response, you're going to get those day two, day three, day four stories.
Yeah, less about being known for having the recall because companies have recalls, but are you being known now for how you handle it? That really can impact your brand. And you alluded to this a little bit, but how can a company know if a recall or even a negative event has had an impact on their reputation?
Yeah, this is a really important one. And it really gets down to having the right data. Um, if you don't have a baseline for measuring your company's reputation, it's going to be really hard to judge whether or not a singular event like a recall has had an effect on that reputation. So I tell all of my clients, and again, this is not even necessarily like, and I'm not selling something that DGA does necessarily, but I tell all of my clients to invest in some sort of reputation tracking mechanism or service or whatever. There are a lot of very smart and sophisticated ways of doing this, but it doesn't have to be super expensive or complex. Like at a bare minimum, you can be tracking over time how your brand is talked about on media and social media. You can also put out like low budget surveys to employees or customers to see how your brand is perceived. And the idea then is to like track that perception or sentiment over time on a regular basis so that you understand how your brand is perceived or how that perception is changing and like most importantly why. And I'll give you an example to kind of bring this to life, like why this is so important. I had a client who was gearing up to announce its first ever recall. It was a kitchen appliance brand who had a devoted following, but they were about to announce a pretty massive recall that involved some serious injuries. And we had about a month lead time between when my firm was brought on and when the recall was going to be announced. And so in pretty short order, we were able to like establish that baseline and we put together a survey that they could send out to their customers and other key audiences to try to get that baseline for how they were perceived and what their reputation was. So fast forward a month, the recall announcement happens. There's a ton of media coverage, and it was obviously a pretty emotional experience for like their executives and their founders who were coming to us and saying, we need a full-blown reputation recovery campaign. Like we need to go on Good Morning America and apologize, all the sorts of like drastic things that in some cases could be appropriate. But we kind of got them to take a step back and put out another survey, like an identical survey to what they did the month before the recall happened, to try to understand what impact the recall had on their reputation and on the trust that their customers had with the brand. And what we found was that the recall had virtually no impact on their company's reputation, which even we weren't totally expecting. But, even among people who were like aware of this recall, they did not think worse of the company. And many even reported brand trust going up after the recall. And so this kind of data is so important because without it, we might be over-indexing on our response or even under-investing in the response. This helps us to kind of match the response with what the actual impact has been on reputation.
And curious, what grade would you give most recalling firms with doing that, with understanding that? A C, B?
Well, yeah, I mean, at best, it depends. Like a lot of the big companies, right? And this is just the reality of budgets, but a lot of the big companies are super sophisticated at tracking reputation. I mean, there's plenty of services out there who can do this. And a lot of the smaller firms don't. And a lot of times it's because they don't have, a super sophisticated comms or marketing team and they don't know how to do this. But this goes for any event, right? Like this isn't just a recall. This is advice for any sort of issues in crisis management. If you establish a baseline or if you're tracking it over time, you understand the impact that a singular event can have. And that's really, really important.
Yeah, I agree. All right. So if a brand does suffer reputational harm during a recall, what strategies can be employed to rebuild consumer confidence, trust, restore that brand equity?
Yeah. So again, I'm going to approach this one with a little bit of humility because communications is really only one piece of the puzzle here. But, after a recall or again, any corporate crisis, there's always like the same kind of first step that you have to take to rebuild reputation or consumer confidence or whatever metric it is that you're wanting to improve. And that first step is to like actually work to figure out the root cause of the problem, like whatever that problem is in the eyes of the consumer. So if you think about that in the context of a recall, like if your company's reputation has suffered after a recall, it's probably because of one of a few reasons. Like either your customers no longer trust you on safety and quality, or they don't trust you to do the right thing, which is worse, or they are questioning just your competency because of how the recall was executed. But so the most common, I guess, would be your customers just don't trust you on safety and quality after a recall. So let's just take that example. Like we need to take actual meaningful steps to change this perception because words alone ain't going to do it.
Right.
So for example, like maybe you overhaul the company's safety and compliance program. Maybe you work with new suppliers who have a better track record on safety. Like you can appoint a chief safety officer or make sure that a board member is like assigned to oversee, safety related stuff. It's these kinds of operational steps that, they're not communications decisions necessarily, but they impact reputation. And so these are the things that we have to align on first. And then once these kinds of steps are put in place, then that's where we can develop a communications campaign, to make sure our consumers see what we've done and they see our commitment to safety. So, the bottom line is like you address the root of the problem first, then you take meaningful actions to address that problem, and then you communicate about it. And there's lots of ways, we can communicate directly and indirectly to make sure that people see and understand everything that we've done, and help rebuild reputation that way. But that's kind of the right cadence of things that needs to happen.
Yeah, makes sense. One side question I always get, and the lawyers a lot of times are like, "Oh, don't apologize, don't admit guilt," But how much empathy should go into a recall? I mean, you've inconvenienced your customers, the consumers. And that question does pop up a bit. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Chris. I mean, this is always a kind of tension point between the communications and the legal teams. Um, I think what we try to impress is like demonstrating empathy it does not equate to an admission of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
If you demonstrate empathy, and there's a pretty wide spectrum of how you can do that, but to at least acknowledge at a minimum, right, to acknowledge the inconvenience that the recall has on consumers or any of your stakeholders, how do you not do that? I mean, it's just as like you're being a human, and you're acknowledging the reality that the recall event it's not an ideal outcome for anyone. Like
Right.
there's some inconvenience to people who have your product, and I think acknowledging that at a minimum is important. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are saying that your product is defective or that you screwed up. It just means you're acknowledging the inconvenience. The other thing I'll say though is, certainly if there are fatalities associated with the recall, same thing. I mean, I think to not acknowledge the pain of those uh, who lost someone, again, you don't have to necessarily say or infer that the product itself caused the fatality, but just
Right.
to express empathy for those individuals. Again, it's like that alone will demonstrate that you, as an organization, are operating not as like some evil big
Right.
corporation, right? Like you have feelings too. You care about your consumers, and obviously what happened was a tragedy. Whether or not it directly resulted from your products is a whole separate story.
Yeah. Important to be human, like you mentioned. So let's talk proactive measures. So what proactive measures should companies take to prepare for a potential recall and to safeguard their brand?
Yeah, I mean, we've already talked about the importance of proactively tracking reputation. Again, good hygiene for managing corporate reputation generally, even outside of recalls, but also really important that companies have some sort of recall plan in place. And generally, this kind of plan would outline the different audiences we may need to communicate with during a recall, the channels we have at our disposal for reaching them, templated materials. It just establishes the basics of how we would communicate during a recall. Doesn't need to be overly prescriptive, but it's important to have some sort of like shortcut reference point that we can use in the event a recall pops up, especially because more and more we're seeing companies be given very little time by the CPSC to prepare. So having some sort of shortcuts is really important. And then finally, like really important for teams to train against that recall plan and make sure that it actually works. So most sophisticated companies run recall simulations that basically put their leadership teams to the test of responding to a highly impactful recall scenario. And this gives them practice, not only executing the recall plan, but just maybe more importantly, it helps them practice making difficult decisions under this time sensitive, kind of stressful, simulated environment. So that's really important. I mean, none of this stuff, the reputation tracking, the plan building, the simulations, like none of it's particularly expensive. I mean, relatively speaking, and they really do go a long way in making sure companies are buttoned up and prepared to really put their best foot forward, if and when a recall does happen.
And the biggest one from a brand standpoint I always see is when you pick your remedy, whether that's you're providing a refund, replacement product, repair, set realistic expectations on what the consumer, the patient, the customer is going to have to go through and the timing of it. Don't just because you want to get them a reimbursement check in 3 weeks, how feasible is that? It's better to set that expectation. It'll take 4 to 6 weeks and get it to them in 3 weeks. But if they're waiting, and I've seen some recalls where they literally said the part was going to come in 3 weeks, and they got hit with such a high volume of response, it was 6 months, and customers are still waiting. So they lost so much brand loyalty from that. So the right expectations is important for sure.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So we do have some questions. We only have about 4 minutes, so we do have some questions here. Let's see. How do you adapt and maneuver product recall in a more remote or hybrid work setup with multiple teams at multiple locations?
So it's a good question. I mean, a couple ways you can do it. One, and does not work for every company, but is at least for like the week of the recall is to just bring everyone together. Some companies prefer to do that just to ease logistics. Certainly don't have to do that. I mean, establishing some sort of like daily stand-up call, twice a day call, where you've got all the different folks that you need. So like, my team to do communications, Chris's team to do, logistics, the legal team, outside legal counsel, in addition to all the relevant functions internally, operations, customer service or customer care, whatever, marketing, legal. Get all the right people on one call, once a day, twice a day, whatever it needs to be, to make sure that we're aligned generally on strategy and tick off some of the priority action items.
Yeah, and I always say too, schedule that call for an hour. If it ends up being 15 minutes, it ends up being 15 minutes. The last thing you want to do is scramble the team when an issue happens. One of those 5% things I mentioned earlier happen, and you got to scramble the team. Quick decisions can be very important. Let's see. How would the PR strategy change dependent on the hazard and if there are injuries involved?
It's a good question. So the second one I'll tackle first. So if there's serious injuries or fatalities involved, again, I think we talked about the empathy element, making sure that's involved. That's really more from a messaging standpoint. But you also have to anticipate there's going to be more media coverage. I mean, it's just one of the factors that I would say correlates to the volume of media coverage. But if there's serious fatalities, you can expect just more interest in general, as there should be, frankly. In terms of the hazard, I don't know how much that dictates the response unless there's some, larger macro context that could impact how the recall is perceived or how relevant it is, right? Like if there's a recall involving, e-bikes or batteries or something, clearly that's all over the news or was certainly a year ago. Maybe that was the height of it. If you have a recall with a product that's all over the news or a product category or a hazard that's causing a lot of news, clearly you're going to have to prepare for, again, higher interest.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. All right. I think we've got time for one more question. This is an interesting one. So, are patients, consumers ever involved in these recall simulations or mock recalls to get their perspective and ensure a patient consumer centric response, centered response? So, I'll let you go, and I have a little feedback on that too.
I love the idea. It's usually not because, everything needs to be very confidential. And so, I think there probably is a way in which you could get that sort of feedback in kind of not anonymous, but like you don't have to necessarily say the purpose of why you're asking for the feedback. But I do love that idea of making sure you have different stakeholders, kind of perspectives included.
Yeah, I fully agree. And you're right. Typically not. You may try to include someone from customer service that talks with the consumers and gets that direct perspective. Someone from sales that may know the customers, the buyers. So there may be some things like that you can do. But I do really like the idea because that North Star really should be the customer in most cases and getting their feedback. I will say we've done some roundtables where we've had manufacturers and distributors and retailers, and then we've also had consumer advocates that can sit in on those as well and almost represent the consumer. But it's a really good thought. How you do it would be interesting, but a good thought. All right, I don't see any additional questions, and we are out of time. This does move very quickly, Jared, so I really appreciate you jumping on and sharing some of your perspective and intel on it. If you have any questions post-webinar, feel free to send those over to Jared and myself, and then just be on the lookout for some of our future webinars that we have as well. But Jared, I do want to thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Take care.
Yep, take care.